All right, everybody, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. Great pleasure right now to welcome to the program U.S. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, author of The Tea Party Goes to Washington, and very much at the heart of the debate going on right now over the budget and the debt. So, Senator Paul, I'm very glad to welcome you to the Peter Schiff Show.
Glad to be with you, Tom.
Now, I just played some excerpts from Timothy Geithner and Nancy Pelosi that more or less suggested that even talking about not raising the debt ceiling or even talking about trying to have spending cuts that outpace the borrowing or whatever is deeply irresponsible and we ought not to be doing it. How do you even function in that atmosphere?
Well, I think raising the debt ceiling is an ideal time to talk about why we keep doing it, why we keep spending more than we take in, and what the debt is and what consequences there are to running such an alarmingly high debt. So, I think precisely the opposite. But I've been saying for over a year now that I think Geithner ought to go. I think we ought to have a vote of no confidence, and he needs to be sent packing. He didn't predict the housing boom. He didn't predict the housing crisis, the banking crisis. And really, everything he's done since he's been in office, I think, has made it worse. Unemployment's higher, the debt's higher, and he's part of this crowd, like Krugman, who basically say deficits don't matter.
Now, your budget, you have a 5-year balanced budget proposal. Can you outline just the basic contours of it, and in what way does it shrink spending? In what areas? How does it do it?
Well, almost two-thirds of the budget is entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. We reform those. We gradually allow the age of eligibility to go up for Social Security and Medicare. We means test the benefits. And then with Medicare, we allow those senior citizens to have the same congressional health care plan that their congressman has. With taxes, we do a flat tax of 17% with very few deductions. And we think this would unleash, an economic boom like we haven't seen in this country in decades.
Does it preserve the mortgage interest deduction?
We leave the mortgage interest deduction in there because people have made a lot of economic decisions based on that. Well, you could eliminate it prospectively. The bottom line is we just need much simpler tax code, and there's so many obstacles to go into a flat tax that I thought rather than going against all of those who are in the business of buying and selling homes and giving mortgages, that I think it's just such an uphill battle that's better just to go ahead and leave that deduction alone.
Yeah, I think that's a wise move. Now, you've been involved in trying to get the Export-Import Bank closed. Now, this may not seem like a particularly interesting topic to the average American, but it's the classic case of corporate welfare, and you would think there would be huge bipartisan support for it. Is that what you found?
Well, the interesting thing is that, we've been complaining about the Department of Energy loans to Solyndra and BrightSource and all of the president's campaign contributors, but it's no different for XM. These are still government-originated loans, taxpayer-financed loans, and if we're against the government loans that the president's giving through the Department of Energy, we ought to be against the XM loans, or we really lose our moral authority if we're not against all of these types of loans.
There's one company that seems to dominate in discussions of the Export-Import Bank, and that, of course, is Boeing, which seems to suggest that they can't possibly be competitive in the world unless they're getting these sort of subsidized loans, which they also, in the same breath, deny are a subsidy. What do you say to them?
Well, see, I'm all for corporations. I want corporations to be bigger and more profitable. I just don't think that the average, ordinary, middle-class taxpayer should have to finance their loans. Many of these companies, I think 80% of the companies who get loans are in the Fortune 500. These are big, profitable firms. I don't want to punish them through taxation, but also don't want to subsidize loans. They can go into the marketplace like anybody else and get loans. And so I think we really need to rethink this. We had one amendment to the bill that failed. But what our amendment says is to countries that we owe money to, people that we are borrowing money from, we shouldn't turn around and loan it back to them in form of subsidized loans. So we actually have borrowed $1 trillion from China, and then we take government-subsidized loans and actually loan it back to China, which to me makes absolutely no sense.
So did that amendment fail?
We didn't even get 10 votes. I mean, that means 3/4 of the Republicans voted against it and all the Democrats. This is why they're not really serious yet up there. There are a few who will say the debt's a problem, but they're not willing to cut even the easy stuff. This is not cutting, food to unwed mothers. This is cutting welfare to multinational corporations, and we can't even get 10 votes to cut anything.
Maybe it turns out that it's politically more difficult to do that than it is to cut the stuff from the unwed mothers.
Well, it's politically difficult for all of it. There really is no willpower. A bunch of them will line up and say, oh, we're for a balanced budget amendment, but then when we put forward a budget that actually meets the definition of the amendment, balances in 5 years, we get 16 votes. The only consolation is we got 16 more votes than the president got for his budget.
Well, that is something, but all this sort of raises the natural question, if they can't vote to get rid of the Export-Import Bank, is there one program that the whole GOP agrees needs to be cut? I mean, maybe Obamacare, but even there, do you think that there is a consensus that among the Republicans that all of Obamacare needs to go?
Well, that's sort of my fear, is that if we're lucky enough that the Supreme Court strikes it down, that we need to be very wary of what goes in its place. I don't think we want Obamacare light. Many of us want more free market mechanisms, more price competition, and more capitalism in health care. But I'm afraid that some of the Republicans might take the easy way out and say, well, why don't we just give them half of Obamacare and make it a little less expensive?
Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk a little bit about the TSA, which is something you've also, you've been a victim of, but you've also been talking quite a bit about. I mean, this is not a very popular agency among the American public, and yet even that, it seems like it's very, very difficult to make any headway. I can understand with Export-Import Bank, there are major, major economic interests at stake there, and they are going to lobby like crazy for that thing. But what on earth are the interests that would entrench the TSA?
Well, I think we actually have a chance of at least getting some reform of the TSA. After I was detained, the next day was the State of the Union, and I went into the House chambers, and half the Democrats were giving me high fives saying, I've been there, and I'm with you. You've come up with a reform, and we'll pass a reform. I've talked with Congressman Issa, who's the chairman over there, and we're working on something called the Passenger Bill of Rights. And it will specify to them what they can and can't do to you, and hopefully make things better. I also would like to expand the airports that use private security, and that's the only thing that may be a sticky wicket, because many on the other side like seeing bigger and bigger government unions. So the entrenched part of this that we battle could be the institution of government unionism.
Yeah, maybe that is what it is. Now, I think there's one pitfall, of course, with getting rid of the TSA that some people would say, well, we'll privatize the TSA, but basically the private firm would still have to enforce the TSA rules. I think the better thing is basically to have the market decide, let the airlines decide. You can fly on an airline that doesn't grope you or do whatever, and maybe you've got a 3 times 10 to the negative 10th additional chance of being on a hijacked flight, or somebody else can go on another airline, and then you just let the market sort it out. What do consumers prefer? That's much preferable. Is that what you favor?
Well, the thing is what you need to do is link up the consumer, the passenger, the air traveler, with the security. So if the same people providing the security are the people you pay your airline ticket to, they're more concerned also about your satisfaction. They're concerned about your dignity and your privacy. So ideally, you're right, the airlines should pay for the security. We do it indirectly now. We tax them, and then the government provides it. So if we could directly link up the consumer, if you've bought an airline ticket for $500, the airline doesn't want you to be upset. So that ideally would be the answer. Whether or not we can get there or not, we're also going to look at in-between steps where we just tell the TSA they can't do pat-downs unless they have a suspicion that you're a terrorist. But we're not going to tolerate random pat-downs. If you go through the machine, see, I think they're programming the machines to do the random pat-downs. The machines go off randomly about every 10th person, and they pat you down. I don't think the machines are that inaccurate, or if they are that inaccurate, then they ought to toss the machines, because you've seen the anatomic pictures of people. Certainly they can't be 1 in 10 person making a mistake and thinking something's on your leg or your arm when it's not. I think that's a programming thing to do random pat-downs, and I was told as much by the TSA privately, but then in public they deny it.
Now, I just read that Congressman Walter Jones has introduced legislation that would clarify and codify presidential war powers and try to reclaim the prerogative of Congress. And then likewise, when the Senate recently took up an extension of sanctions on Iran, you offered an amendment that would have explicitly barred war with Iran or Syria. This seems a bit It's incredible that we've gotten to this point where the Congress has to try and pass laws to stop the outbreak of war when, strictly speaking, it's their prerogative to declare the war in the first place. Is there any chance of movement on this, or is this just hopeless?
Well, there is a certain amount of irony that we have to restate the Constitution on bills to make sure they're not going to break the Constitution. And that's essentially what we did. And, in fact, some on their side complained. They said, we aren't saying anything in here about declaring war. And I said, well, that's precisely the point, is that the language is becoming harsher and harsher and saying more adamantly that we will not tolerate this, this, and this, that it sounds to me like you are trying to declare war without declaring war. So we actually have wording on the Iran sanctions that says nothing in this bill is to imply to be a declaration of war or a use of authorization of force. And actually yesterday we got an announcement from Harry Reid that he's going to include that language.
Oh, all right. Well, that is very interesting. All right, we've got to take a break. On the other side of this break, more with Senator Rand Paul. And, in fact, before we do that, you send out a weekly email notice telling people about what you're up to. How do people get on that list?
If they'll go to our government website, which, you can Google it. I think it's paul.gov.senate. But just look it up on the internet and get on. There is a place where you can sign up for our email list, and we provide people with all the different legislative things that we're fighting that particular week. And I will say I've only got another couple of minutes, but we may be able to come back for a real short segment. I've got to be on another radio at 9:50.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if we'll be able to do that. We'll certainly do our best. Let me ask the control room people: Can we float this break? And we'll take the break in just a couple of minutes. Okay, so we are going to float. All right. A couple quick things that remain. Number one is there's a rumor circulating that there's terrific pressure being placed on your father to endorse Mitt Romney on the grounds that it would be an obstacle to your political career if he did not do so. Is there anything to that, and do you want your father to endorse Mitt Romney?
I think he'll make his decision independent of anything that, would indicate something about my future, or not because he, doesn't care for me. I just think he will make his decision completely on what he is comfortable with, and I won't ask him to do anything. Now, I have said that, I'm the senator from the state of Kentucky. I'm a Republican senator, and I will support the nominee. But his decision, he's basically got to make on his own, and I'm putting no pressure on him.
And another issue that's come up just among some of the Ron Paul faithful involves the U.S. Senate race in Texas. There's a fellow running named Ted Cruz who has the endorsement of both you and your father. And some people are concerned that Ted Cruz is initially endorsed Rick Perry, which for me that's a red flag. You can't. I don't know how you can really be serious and endorse Rick Perry. Whereas there's a candidate who actually endorsed your father, Glenn Addison, who didn't win the endorsement. Can you explain what was the thinking behind the Ted Cruz endorsement?
Well, if you've heard Ted Cruz and looked at his website, you'll see that he has strong feelings about protecting American sovereignty. He's actually defended the U.S. against people trying to take us into world court when he was the Solicitor General. He is also in favor of auditing the Fed. He's opposed to the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens. He's had that all over his website. And we're never all going to agree on every issue, but my conclusion is that Ted Cruz has a real chance of winning. He's in a solid second place now and may get to a runoff, and that it really is a three-way competitive primary right now. Texas is a huge, huge state, and it takes millions and millions of dollars to run, and I think Ted Cruz has a real chance. I think he will be part of the very conservative part of the Senate, and I think we'll have some libertarian tendencies as well. But like I say, not everybody will be perfect, but I think right now where the middle of the Republican caucus is, he's going to be significantly to the right and more in the camp of myself and Senator DeMint and Senator Lee.
Well, some people would say, though, that your father had to fight against exactly that. Well, I'd love to support him, but because he really is really good on all the issues, but he doesn't have much of a chance, so I'll support the second best guy. I mean, that's what people are concerned is happening.
I don't know who is the second best guy. I just know Ted Cruz. I know he'll be a great U.S. Senator, and that's who I'm supporting.
All right, Senator Rand Paul, we much appreciate the time. I know you got to run to be on another program. Thanks so much for the time on the Peter Schiff Show today.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Senator Rand Paul, everybody. All right, now we're going to take our break. All right, everybody, we're back on the Peter Schiff Show. Tom Woods in for Peter. This is going to be a very short segment because we floated the break so we could keep Senator Paul on a little bit longer. Now, of course, everybody knows that I speak only for myself. I don't speak for Peter. Obviously, Peter and I have a great deal of agreement across a great many subjects, but I don't in any way ever mean to implicate him in anything. And I say that as a preface to what I'm about to say, which is on the subject of Mitt Romney, there's a real parallel in what we talked about earlier this morning, where we're talking about how there never seems to be a good time to talk about cutting spending or cutting the debt, because there's always some excuse why, well, now it just won't work, and now you can't do it, and there's never a good time. They never say, well, but next week we can talk about it. It's never. Well, the same thing goes for, like, every 4 years, conservatives, libertarians get frustrated with the Republican nominee. And every 4 years, people like Ann Coulter hector them and lecture them for being so uppity, wanting somebody that they might actually respect to be running. And she'll say things like, but now's not the time to make demands like this. The country's coming apart under President whoever, whatever interchangeable nobody it is. Now's not the time. I mean, you people can't expect perfection now. When can we expect decency? When? I mean, don't tell me now's not the time if you're not going to tell me when the time is. Because I take that to mean there never is a time. That you're basically giving me the same line that Pelosi gives me about the debt. You're giving me the same line the Europeans give me about the debt. You're giving that to me about candidates. There's never a good time. It's all now, right now. Sure, we'll talk about the debt in the future, but right now we really, really got to just keep this recovery going. And that's all garbage. We know that. We're never going to get that conversation about the debt. We're never going to get a conversation about why we can't have a non-robot running for president as a Republican. That seems like a legitimate question. So I can understand perfectly well, given that it's my view also, why somebody would say, you know what, I know Obama's a bad guy, I get it, but at some point we have to just bite the bullet and say, even though I know it's going to be hard, I know that maybe Romney might make some marginal change in one direction. Of course, he'll make a lot of rotten changes in other directions too. But right now, the fight really is against the whole establishment. And we've got to just keep our eye on the ball, because if we're going to keep having the choice between Obama and Romney, that sort of choice, it's going to destroy the country. And at some point, a patriot has to stand up and say, I'm not going to be suckered into this anymore. I mean, I didn't just fall off the turnip truck. I'm not the village idiot. I'm not going to be roped into voting for a robot because the other guy's a worse robot. At some point, this is a toxic combination. The combination of a Romney and Obama sort of choice is toxic for the country. And at some point, you have to say, in the past, maybe I've said, I guess I shouldn't expect perfection right now. I'll pull the lever for this guy. I'll pull the lever for George W. Bush, who then gives us a record that is far worse than we would have gotten under a Democrat, because a Democrat couldn't have gotten away with half the stuff that Bush got away with. At some point, you just have to say no. And the reason I bring this up is that in talking to Senator Paul, I mean, I'm certain that there is pressure being put on Ron Paul. And, we know Ron Paul is a very principled guy, and if a candidate doesn't agree with him on key things, he's just not going to endorse him. And he's not going to say, you can't vote for him. That's not his way. His view is you make your own judgment according to your own values. But I, as a person in good conscience, can't support somebody I believe to be dangerously in the wrong in critical areas and not different from the incumbent anyway. And, of course, he will be told, but it's for your son, and what kind of father are you? It's for your son. You got to just grit your teeth and do this. I assume he's not tempted to do it, but I just want to make clear that we all are 1,000% behind him if he wants to hold his ground, and this is what we expect from him, and it would absolutely destroy his legacy. He would be remembered as, after having put all this effort in, the thing he'd be remembered for would be being a big sellout. This would be terrible for his legacy. It would absolutely fracture his legacy, and he would win nothing for it in exchange. So here's to bucking up the courage of Congressman Paul, who doesn't need our bucking up, but nevertheless, once in a while, when you're the only sane person in the world, yeah, you could use a little reinforcement once in a while to be reminded of the troops who are out there cheering for you, who are behind you. We're behind you, Ron Paul, the one person who's going to tell the truth and stand up to the Obama versus Romney axis of evil. We're with you.